The city of Jonesboro sits in the northeastern corner of Arkansas, a place where the Mississippi Delta begins to flatten out into farmland, and the pace of life tends to slow down as the sun sets. On the evening of August 11th, 2023, that slow pace was interrupted on a residential street that had never made the news before. The homes here are modest but well kept, with driveways that hold family sedans and front yards where children's toys often rest on the grass. It is the kind of neighborhood where neighbors wave to each other, but mostly keep to themselves, respecting the privacy of the families behind the closed doors. When the call came into the Jonesboro Police Department, the dispatcher noted it as a routine domestic disturbance. A man and a woman were fighting, and it had gotten physical. It was the kind of call that officers handle every shift, the kind that usually ends with someone sleeping on the couch or staying with a friend for the night. But as the patrol cars turned onto the street, their lights reflecting off the quiet houses, the officers had no way of knowing that the argument inside had already exposed something far more troubling. The 17-year-old boy who made the call stood outside, waiting for the police to arrive. He was the calm one, the one who had the presence of mind to dial 911 when the adults in his life lost control. He pointed toward the house and tried to explain what had happened, but even he did not yet know the full extent of what was about to be uncovered. Behind him, the front door stood slightly ajar, and inside a 13-year-old girl was waiting in the aftermath of events that would soon demand the attention of detectives, child advocates, and the courts. The officers approached the door with the usual caution, expecting to find a couple nursing bruised egos and perhaps some minor injuries. They had no reason to suspect that the night would end with a confession to child rape and a family torn apart forever. Officer body cameras activated as the first responder approached the house. The recorded footage would later become a critical piece of evidence in a case that expanded far beyond a simple fight. Inside, the atmosphere was chaotic. Christy Kluk, the mother of the 17-year-old caller, was visibly agitated, her speech rapid and her emotions running close to the surface. She was eager to explain herself, to justify the situation to the officer who now stood in her living room. She spoke about stress, about family problems, about her own mother being in jail. She mentioned her daughter, the 13-year-old, and how the girl was struggling to cope. And then, almost casually, she mentioned giving the girl alcohol. The officer, trained to listen for details that signal deeper issues, asked her to clarify. Christy explained that she let the girl drink to calm her nerves, to help her deal with the emotional weight of the family's troubles. It was an explanation that raised immediate concerns, but the officer pressed further. How much alcohol was she giving the child? Christy did not hesitate. She described a specific night, the night her own mother was arrested, when she had given the 13-year-old approximately 13 shots of Jack Daniel's whiskey. The number hung in the air, stark and undeniable. 13 shots for a child. The officer's focus shifted instantly. The domestic dispute between Christy and her fiancé was no longer the primary issue. The safety of the minor in the house became the immediate priority. Christy Kluk was detained, and the investigation turned from a standard disturbance call to a child protection matter. The girl was removed from the home and taken to a facility where forensic interviewers could speak with her in a safe environment, away from the tension and the chaos of the night. The officers on scene exchanged glances, recognizing that they had walked into something much larger than a simple argument. The night was just beginning, and the worst was yet to come. While Christy Kluk was processed on charges related to the physical altercation and the endangerment of her daughter, a separate and more serious investigation was quietly beginning. The 13-year-old girl sat down with a trained forensic interviewer, a professional skilled in speaking with children who have experienced trauma. The room was designed to be non-threatening, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture, a stark contrast to the home she had just left. The interviewer asked questions carefully, allowing the girl to tell her story in her own words and at her own pace. What the girl disclosed was not about the fight between her mother and her mother's fiancé. It was about James Mansfield himself. She described events that, if true, constituted serious criminal offenses. The details she provided were specific and disturbing, painting a picture of abuse that had been happening behind the closed doors of the family home. The forensic interviewers documented every word, every detail, building a record that would be used to protect the child and to pursue charges against the accused. Once the interview was complete, the information was relayed to the detectives handling the case. The focus of the investigation shifted entirely from the domestic dispute to the allegations of child sexual abuse. An arrest warrant was prepared for James Mansfield. He was no longer a witness or a victim in a domestic fight. He was a suspect in a much darker crime. The detectives knew that the coming interrogation would be critical. They had the child's statement, but they needed more. They needed to hear from James himself. They needed to see if he would confess or if he would force the case to trial. The preparation for the interview began immediately, with detectives reviewing the facts and planning their approach. They knew that the next few hours would determine the course of the entire case. The clock was ticking, and James Mansfield had no idea what was waiting for him at the police station. James Mansfield was brought into the interrogation room at the Jonesboro Police Department late that night. The room was small and institutional, with pale walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and a single camera mounted in the corner recording everything. James sat down in the hard plastic chair, his posture relaxed, his expression calm. He appeared to believe that he was there as a witness, perhaps to clarify the events of the domestic dispute that had brought officers to the house earlier. When the detective entered and sat across from him, James offered explanations freely. He spoke about the family's problems, about Christy's emotional state, about the stress of having her mother in jail. He described himself as a stabilizing force, the one trying to keep things together while everyone else fell apart. He mentioned the 13-year-old girl, referring to her as troubled, but blaming her behavior on her mother's influence. He used a specific phrase to describe her, saying she was just like her mom, implying that she was manipulative and prone to lying. The detective listened without interruption, allowing James to establish his own narrative. James spoke about the drinking, admitting that the girl had been given alcohol, but framing it as something her mother did, not him. He mentioned that the girl had once said something about wanting to hook up with him, but he claimed he had rejected her, blaming it on the alcohol she had consumed. He positioned himself as the responsible adult who had tried to set boundaries, telling the girl the drinking had to stop. The detective took notes, but he was also listening for inconsistencies, for the moments where James's story did not quite line up with the facts already known. James seemed confident, comfortable in his own explanations. He did not yet know that the girl had already spoken, and that her words were now sitting in a file waiting to be used. The detective listening to James Mansfield was not a newcomer to interrogations. He had sat across from dozens of suspects over the years, and he knew that the first stories people told were often the ones they had rehearsed in their own minds. James's narrative was coherent, but it was also careful. Too careful for someone who was simply explaining a family dispute. The detective allowed James to finish his account before changing the direction of the conversation. He leaned forward slightly and began asking questions that seemed hypothetical, but were in reality designed to probe the edges of James's confidence. He asked about the girl's character, about her truthfulness, about whether she had ever made accusations before. James repeated his assertion that she was manipulative, that she lied the way her mother lied. The detective then asked a question that shifted the ground beneath James's feet. He asked if there was any possibility that James's DNA might be found on the girl. The question was direct, and it landed with weight. James hesitated. He said there shouldn't be any DNA, but then he offered explanations for why there might be. He mentioned shared laundry, towels, the possibility of clothes getting mixed up. He was already building defenses against evidence that had not yet been presented. The detective listened to the explanations without challenging them. He simply noted them and then left the room, leaving James alone with the camera and the silence. In interrogation training, this is known as the strategic pause. It gives the suspect time to think, to worry, to imagine what the detective might be doing outside the room. James sat at the table, his eyes moving around the room, his confidence beginning to crack under the weight of his own imagination. The minutes that James Mansfield spent alone in the interrogation room were longer than they appeared on the clock. The camera recorded him sitting still, looking down at the table, occasionally shifting in his chair. He had no window to the outside, no way of knowing what the detective was doing or what evidence might be accumulating against him. In those moments of silence, the mind becomes its own worst enemy. James had time to think about the forensic interview, about what the girl might have said, about the DNA test that the detective had mentioned. He had time to calculate the odds, to weigh his options, to consider whether his initial story would hold up under scrutiny. When the detective finally returned, the atmosphere in the room had changed. The detective sat down and adopted a different tone, one that was less about accusation and more about understanding. He spoke about mistakes, about how everyone makes them, about how alcohol can impair judgment and lead people to do things they would never do sober. He was offering James a way out, a narrative that allowed him to admit to something without being labeled a monster. He explained the legal definition of rape, distinguishing between violent force and acts that are illegal simply because of age. He suggested that some people who commit these acts need help, not punishment. The words were carefully chosen, designed to give James a path toward confession. James listened, and the detective could see that he was considering it. The silence had done its work, softening the defenses that James had built. The question now was whether he would take the path that was being offered, or whether he would cling to his original story and force the case to trial. James Mansfield began to shift in his seat, his body language betraying the internal conflict that the silence had created. He mentioned again that the girl had told him they hooked up, but he claimed he did not remember it. He said he had been drinking that night, that he had passed out, that his memory of the evening was fragmented at best. It was a partial admission, a way of acknowledging that something might have happened while maintaining that he was not fully responsible for it. The detective did not challenge the claim of blacking out. He did not argue about the nature of memory or the effects of alcohol. Instead, he accepted the statement and built upon it. He returned to the topic of DNA, reminding James that the forensic exam would provide physical evidence that could not be explained away by shared laundry or mixed-up clothes. He asked a direct question, one that required a yes or no answer. Was his DNA going to come back? James paused. The room was silent except for the hum of the recording equipment. He looked at the table. He looked at the detective. And then he gave his answer. He said yes. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of everything that had come before it. The detective followed up, asking for confirmation of the act itself. James's response was fragmented, a mix of denial and admission. He said yes and no. He said yeah. He was struggling to form the words, to make the reality of what he had done fit with the image of himself he wanted to maintain. The confession was not clean or straightforward, but it was there, recorded on tape for use in court. Once the admission was made, the atmosphere in the interrogation room shifted again. James seemed to deflate, his shoulders dropping, his eyes losing focus. He looked at the detective and asked what was going to happen to him. The question was not legal. It was personal. He was asking about his future, about his life, about whether there was any way back from the place where he now found himself. He said that his life was ruined, that this mistake would follow him forever. The detective responded by returning to the theme of help. He told James that this did not have to define him, that he could get help, that he could eventually become someone who mentored others to avoid the same path. It was a message of redemption, offered in a moment when James most needed to hear it. James listened, and for a moment, he seemed to grasp at the possibility. He took a breath and offered his final words on the subject. He said he was sorry this happened. The phrasing was notable for what it omitted. He did not say he was sorry for what he did. He did not accept agency for the acts he had just admitted. He framed the event as something that occurred rather than something he caused. But in the context of the interrogation and the evidence that would follow, the words were sufficient. The detective stood up, signaling that the interview was over. James remained seated, his hands on the table, his eyes on the wall. He knew that when he left this room, he would not be going home. The case against James Mansfield moved through the Arkansas court system over the following months. The charges filed against him were severe, reflecting the nature of the crimes disclosed by the victim. He faced 4 counts of rape and 1 count of engaging in sexual contact in the presence of a child. The multiple counts indicated that the abuse was not a single incident, but a pattern of behavior that had occurred over time. James remained in custody while the legal process unfolded, his bond set at a level that ensured he would not be released pending trial. For nearly 2 years, the details of the case remained largely out of the public eye, known only to the families involved and the officers who had worked the investigation. Then, on July 15, 2025, James Mansfield appeared before a judge for sentencing. The court handed down a sentence of 45 years in the Arkansas Department of Corrections. It was a term that would keep him behind bars for the majority of his remaining life, a punishment that reflected the gravity of the crimes against the child who had trusted him. As for Christy Cluck, the mother whose admission about the alcohol had first alerted officers to the danger in the home, her legal journey ended differently. The domestic battery charges against her were dropped in April of 2024. She faced no jail time for the events of that night, though the consequences of her actions would follow her in other ways. The family was broken, and the child at the center of it all was left to rebuild a life without the adults who had failed her. After the sentencing, after the cameras left the courthouse and the news cycles moved on to other stories, the central figure in this case remained invisible. The 13-year-old girl who had disclosed the abuse, who had sat through a forensic interview and described events no child should experience, vanished from the public record. There were no updates on her well-being, no statements from family members, no indications of where she was living or how she was coping with the aftermath of the crimes committed against her. In cases like this, the privacy of the victim is protected by law, and that protection is essential. But it also means that the public is left with an incomplete story, a narrative that ends with a conviction, but not with resolution. The house on the quiet street in Jonesboro still stands, and the neighborhood still looks much as it did on the night of August 11, 2023. But behind the closed doors of that home, and in the life of the girl who once lived there, the effects of that night continue. The courts determined the fate of James Mansfield. They decided that he would spend 45 years in prison for his crimes. But the question of what happened to the girl, of whether she found safety and healing, remains unanswered. It is a question that lingers long after the case file is closed, a reminder that justice in a courtroom does not always mean resolution in a life. The story of the 13-year-old girl is not over. It simply continues, somewhere out of sight, known only to those who are charged with her care and to the girl herself, who must carry the weight of these events into her future.